Hello and welcome to part 3 of 3 for the dead and the dying. This video will cover cemetery iconography and recording headstones. My name is Rebecca Whitman-Coford, certified genealogist and certified genealogical lecturer. The fence around a cemetery is foolish, for those inside can't come out and those outside don't want in. Arthur Brisbane. For this 3-part lecture series on the dead and the dying, we cover these topics. In this third and final part of the series, the focus is on iconography and recording headstones using examples. Before we discuss iconography, let's get in the mood a little with some early rituals surrounding death and superstitions. Using some generalizations for the United States, we know that customs and rituals were influenced mostly by religious beliefs, and they changed over time. The first to lay out the dead were women, but when undertaking businesses started, men were the ones who exclusively ran them. The Puritan attitudes of the 1700s were mostly bleak and pessimistic, so you see a lot of depictions of skulls and fear of the afterlife. But in the 1800s, those times brought images of hope and more immortality, angels and rebirth. But before 1830, most people were buried in family plots. 1831 is when we saw the first large planned community burial park. It was Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Let's explore some deathly superstitions. A bird flying into the room of a sick person was an omen of death, because apparently birds would carry the souls of humans. A mirror would be covered or turned at the time of death, because that was a portal to evil spirits at the time of death. A widow would wear black, not to identify her as a widow, but to keep her hidden from her husband's evil spirit. I don't know where he turns from loving husband to evil spirit, but apparently it happens. Pallbearers would also wear gloves to handle the casket, or the spirit of the dead would possess them. On that same topic, hold your breath while passing a cemetery or you will be possessed. And anybody interrupting a funeral procession will incur the wrath of evil spirits, so they need to back up all the way. So basically, if anything happens, flies, gets dreamed about, falls, spilt, broken, grows funny, howls, smelled funny, or even folded into weird ways, it means someone's about to die. Everything seemed to be a portent of death. Let's look at iconography. I really like the book by Douglas Keister, Stories in Stone, a field guide to cemetery symbolism and iconography. He says, "Dead men tell no tales, but their tombstones do. Besides informing us of names and dates of birth and death, tombstone symbols often tell us a person's religion, ethnicity, social membership, occupation, and thoughts on the afterlife." Here are 3 symbols that you today can easily recognize, and I don't need to explain them. You already know the ideas and concepts behind each and their uses. But your ancestors wouldn't have a clue what these were if they were shown. So it's a good idea to do some investigation into the context of what might be behind the symbols or the meaning of the symbols your ancestors used. Let's look at some examples, because our ancestors saw in pictures and imagery more than in words, especially if they were illiterate or they had little need of books because they read the land and they read the weather and they read the animals, and that was all they needed. Icons were a world of meaning to them, much more than it is to us sometimes. In funerary art, a wheel could be endless force of divine power. Doors were hope and opportunity, and a pineapple could mean immortality. Before continuing, I acknowledge that the iconography later reflected in this video will refer to American symbolic funeral art, mainly with Christian flavor. There is so much more that we could do to explore other American and world cultures and religions. However, there simply is not time. This discussion is an introduction into the concepts of using symbolism to represent the emotions and the cultures by our ancestors' interpretations, not our own. Victorian-styled funerary art will be the main example today. What we find is that many meanings, many images and motifs are found together in single monuments. And this one is no exception. Here is a mourner with bellflowers. The mourner represents constant grief, and the bellflowers are constancy and gratitude. This is a winged angel with a lily. Angels are intermediaries between God and man. And the Madonna lily, also known as an Easter lily, is a symbol of purity. I like this one very much. Doors are hope and opportunity, but also transition from one life to the next. And there's so many layers of symbolism in this one. Draperies are usually considered a veil between life and death, but they can be used in a lot of ways, and draperies are used very, very often. If, for example, draped over a book, then it means the interruption of life's work. Roses, any kind of flowers, are used in so many different ways, and not just the flower itself, but at different stages. A bud may be representative of a child. So roses are love, hope, beauty, or deep longing. But a wreath of roses could be beauty and virtue. The shield could be protection, faith, or defense of the spirit. And I was surprised to find that the nautical rope was a commitment to Christianity. Lambs are purity and innocence, and we see these very often on burials for young children. Doves are another symbol found on children's graves. Beds are not seen very often, but when they do, they're very interesting. It means only sleeping or a belief in the resurrection and afterlife. Here's an image of urns and weeping willows, and this symbol is layered with meaning, but also we realize that it could have multiple meanings to choose from, because the urn could be immortality, or it could mean sorrow and mourning. The weeping willow could be tears and sadness, or immortality and hope in the life after death. So we don't always know exactly what the ancestor is meaning or trying to convey. Trees cut short are seen very often. A cut tree could be a life cut short, or they could be a symbol of rejoining nature or the tree of life. There was a lot of them in part of what was called the Woodman's Circle, and that was an insurance company that would provide for families, and they would provide headstones for free as part of that. And the groups would prioritize hard work and selflessness, and they usually were lumbermen. This one in particular has a lily that shows immortality, but the fern shows frankness, humility, and sincerity. And these can get very complex. You sometimes will see these two of them together to indicate a husband and wife, or you'll see vines and different sections of logs intertwined below that indicate each of their children. They can get very complex and beautiful. Iconography can inform in direct ways, such as memorializations of occupations or hobbies. This one is a sailor. And sometimes we just don't know. This jagged rock with a pickaxe at the top, is this an occupation? Is he a miner? Or is it a personal creed? Because the husband's plaque on the side says, "A diamond in the rough." You see a lot of these social organizations and affiliations, like this one for the Freemasons. And there are many with military designations. And I'd also like to talk about the variants on Christian crosses, to always notice those. The military designation here, this one from the Arlington National Cemetery, was LCDR USN. That's a Lieutenant Commander Department Head of the US Navy. He uses a Russian Orthodox Church cross, and she uses more of a traditional cross, so she could be a member of any number of Christian denominations that uses that. And sometimes we just find different surname spellings that can help us with our research. So when you're ready to go to the cemetery, here are some things that you can consider. Sometimes there's just nothing we can do to record that stone. Headstones and monuments are so much more fragile than people realize. Stone itself is porous, and it soaks up the rain and any other substances exposed to it. Some stone is more porous or fragile than others, and cemetery stones are not just open to the elements, but also to vandalism, urban development, and careless maintenance. So when you prepare to visit, here's some ideas. Check the visiting hours, rules, and general guidelines. Some cemeteries are very strict, so you'll want to know that before you go. If there's a cemetery on private land, make sure you ask permission of the owners first, and take a notebook so that you can describe the placement within the cemetery, especially if it's not a cemetery that's very distinctly cut out into sections. Garden shears to trim the tall grass around, but that's only if you use it with permission and do not scratch the stone. The only thing that I ever consider using is a very soft toothbrush, a soft cloth. And a damp sponge is something we're going to use separately for something else I'll show you in a minute. I only put water on the stone, if anything, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And I take with me a roll of regular aluminum foil, not heavy aluminum foil. I take a camera, obviously, or my phone, and insect repellent every time. Reflective screens are a must. It could be a cardboard covered in aluminum foil, silver-covered sunshade from the front dash of your car, or one of those collapsible reflective screens that photographers use. Although, do not ever climb fences or trespass. So, do not ever use chemicals or substances of any kind on the stones except just water. Ammonia, vinegar, shaving cream, cleaners, any kind of soap will eat the stones. Flour, cornstarch, baby powder, and chalk of any kind, these chemicals in them, or just the elements themselves, even if you brush it off really well, there will still be small bits on there. And when it rains next, those bits will expand, get in the stone, and break down the stones. And surprisingly, people bring paint and they paint the stones. And cemetery staff spends a lot of time cleaning paint off of stones. It's terrible. Do not move the stones. Do not use heavy brushes, pumice stones, or any wire scrubbers. Again, I only use a very soft toothbrush, and if it doesn't come off with that, I'm not taking anything off. And out of courtesy, don't photograph other visitors or another funeral. It's a good idea. I would recommend looking at the website for cemetery conservators for United Standards. They go further on describing how stones can be damaged over time and how to protect them. Here's an example of a stone being what happened after being roughly scrubbed. So here's my idea about the foil. A lot of people like to take rubbings, and you can do that with paper or cloth. And the first thing you need to know about that is if you do that, you wrap it all the way around and you tape it to itself. You never use the adhesive straight on the stone because that will damage the stone eventually. I don't like doing that because you kind of have to rub hard, and I don't like rubbing hard on the stones at all. So this is what I am recommending, and one of my favorite things to do right now. I put foil around the stone. It attaches easily, and it goes from this to this. Isn't that amazing? Such an improvement. And I could see so much more. And that's even what I did is I rubbed it with the damp sponge. And that's just a very light rubbing. I didn't have to rub hard. So I don't feel I'm damaging the stone at all. And I felt a lot better about this. And then I can just either take this home or I can recycle this. But try your very best not to damage the stone in any way. Here's some best practices for photographing. Take a full image, then close-ups. Take some images from the side because sometimes you can see the cuts better that way. And then take it in situ so that you can see the stones around it and be able to see where it was sitting in relation to other stones. If you're photographing a stone, don't do it standing. I get a lot of these from people, and I only see the top of the stone and I can't read the stone at all. This is a bad idea. Instead, crouch down and face the stone directly. If you're doing a ground stone, best to avoid photographing your own shadows over the stone or feet. Use a reflector to highlight the stone when the sun is behind, or just use that reflector at all, just because the reflector will really help pick out the carvings. It's amazing, and you don't have to touch the stone at all. Some final thoughts. Death was a time of loss, but it was also the time when many, many records were created. Cemeteries themselves were developed in stages over time. They were moved, they were recreated, and they were enjoyed. They went from scary places to places that were parks where people would picnic and remember their loved ones. It's a good idea to consult reference guides for the culture surrounding the death rituals of your ancestors' funerary symbolism, because it's going to differ from modern concepts. And of course, before you go to the cemetery, prepare your supplies and understand the rules and the visiting hours, but mostly care for the stones just as much as you care for the ancestors that they represent. Before we go on, I want to show you one more memorial stone, or at least the back of it. Now, don't tell me you aren't considering it. Thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed this part and parts 1 and 2 of The Dead and the Dying. Enjoy the conference.